A blizzard-hardened Wyoming rancher discovers his quiet Chinese cook has been sleeping in the frozen barn like livestock, and when he finally brings her inside, he ignites a battle between shame, desire, and a town that will burn them both to protect its own poisonous pride. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next in the winter of 1888 will change everything you thought you knew about courage, love, and what it truly means to come home. The wind came down from the Medicine Bow Range like a wolf with its teeth bared, carrying snow sharp enough to cut exposed skin. Silas Vane stood on the porch of his ranch house with his coat collar turned up and his hat pulled low, watching the last light bleed out of the western sky. The cold didn't bother him anymore. Nothing much did. He was 34 years old and looked 50. The Wyoming frontier had a way of aging a man faster than time alone ever could. His face was all hard angles and wind-carved lines, his eyes the color of winter ice. 2 years ago, those eyes had watched his wife and infant son lowered into frozen ground on the same bitter afternoon, and something inside him had gone down into that earth with them. He'd stopped speaking unless he had to, stopped smiling, stopped feeling much of anything except the dull, relentless ache of survival. The only reason he kept the ranch running at all was the little girl inside the house behind him. Cora, his brother's daughter, 7 years old, dark-haired, bright-eyed, and too damn smart for her own good. When typhoid took her parents 6 months back, Silas had ridden 3 days through a spring storm to bring her home. She was the only blood he had left in the world, and he'd be damned if he'd let her grow up in some orphanage back east where they'd strip the wildness out of her and teach her to be ashamed of who she was. But raising a child when you could barely stand to be alive yourself was harder than breaking horses in a lightning storm. He turned and went back inside, stamping snow off his boots in the mudroom. The warmth hit him immediately, not just heat from the stove, but something richer. The smell of ginger and garlic, soy sauce, and roasted meat, spices he couldn't name but had come to crave without realizing it. Mei Lian was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen. Silas hung his coat on the peg and moved through the house with the heaviness of a man who carried ghosts on his shoulders. The main room was dim, lit only by the fire and a single oil lamp. Cora sat cross-legged on the rug near the hearth, bent over a slate with a piece of chalk, practicing her letters. She looked up when he came in and her face brightened. "Uncle Silas! Mei Lian made dumplings!" He grunted, which was about as much enthusiasm as he could muster, and crossed to the kitchen doorway. Mei Lian stood at the cast-iron stove with her back to him, stirring something in a wide pan. She was small, barely came up to his shoulder, and slight, her black hair pinned back in a single braid that fell to her waist. She wore the same plain gray dress she always did, patched at the elbows and hem, and moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago not to draw attention to herself. She'd been working for him for 4 months. Silas had hired her in October, desperate and half out of his mind trying to keep Cora fed and the house from falling into complete chaos. A drifter passing through had mentioned a Chinese woman in town looking for work, any work, and Silas had gone to find her more out of desperation than charity. He'd expected someone older, harder. What he'd found was a young woman, maybe 25, standing outside the boarding house with a canvas bag at her feet and fear written all over her face. She spoke almost no English. He spoke no Chinese, but she could cook, and that was all he cared about. He'd offered her room and board plus $2 a week. She'd nodded once, picked up her bag, and followed him home without a word. That was 4 months ago. In that time, she had transformed his house. Meals appeared on the table 3 times a day. Real meals, not the burnt bacon and scorched coffee he'd been forcing down. The floors were scrubbed, the laundry was done, Cora's dresses were mended, and somehow, without him even noticing, the air inside the house had started to feel less like a tomb. Mei Lian glanced over her shoulder when she heard his boots on the floorboards, and for just a second, her dark eyes met his. Then she looked away quickly, the way she always did, and turned back to the stove. "Dinner soon," she said softly, her accent wrapping around the English words like silk around stone. "Fine." That was the extent of most of their conversations. Silas turned and walked back into the main room, lowering himself into the chair by the fire. Cora abandoned her slate and climbed into his lap without asking, the way she did every evening. She was warm and small and alive, and he wrapped one arm around her without thinking about it. "She's teaching me words," Cora said, tilting her head back to look up at him. "In Chinese. I can count to 10 now. Want to hear?" "Sure." Cora rattled off a string of syllables that meant nothing to him, her face glowing with pride. Silas nodded as if he understood, and she beamed. 20 minutes later, Mei Lian brought the food to the table. Dumplings, just like Cora had said, steamed and golden, filled with pork and cabbage and something faintly sweet he couldn't identify. There was also rice, stir-fried vegetables, and a small dish of pickled radish that made his mouth water just looking at it. They ate in silence, the way they always did. Cora chattered between bites, telling him about a robin she'd seen that morning and a story Mei Lian had told her about a fox spirit. Silas half listened, shoveling food into his mouth and trying not to think about how good it tasted, how warm the room felt, how dangerously close to normal this all was. Mei Lian sat at the far end of the table, eating quickly and quietly, her eyes down. She always ate last, always took the smallest portions, always disappeared the moment the meal was over. When they finished, Cora helped clear the plates, and Mei Lian washed them in the basin by the stove. Silas sat by the fire with a cup of coffee, watching the flames and listening to the wind howl outside. He was bone-tired, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. "Uncle Silas," Cora's voice broke through the fog. "Can Mei Lian read me a story tonight?" He looked over at her. She was standing beside Mei Lian at the sink, holding a dish towel, her face hopeful. Mei Lian's hand stilled in the water. "She's got work to do," Silas said. "Please? Just one?" Mei Lian glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once. "One story," she said quietly. Cora let out a squeal of delight and bolted for the bedroom. Mei Lian dried her hands and followed, moving like a shadow through the house. Silas stayed where he was, staring into the fire. Half an hour later, the house was quiet. Cora was asleep. Mei Lian had finished the washing and the sweeping and whatever the hell else she did every night, and now she was gone. Silas stood and stretched, his back cracking. He moved through the house, checking the doors and windows the way he always did before bed. Everything was locked tight. Everything was in order. He was halfway to his own room when he stopped. Where the hell did Mei Lian sleep? The thought hit him like a fist to the gut. 4 months. She'd been here 4 months, and he'd never once asked. Never once thought about it. He'd assumed she had a room somewhere. One of the spare bedrooms upstairs, maybe. Or the small storage room off the kitchen. But now, standing in the dim hallway with the wind rattling the shutters, he realized he didn't actually know. He turned and walked back through the house, moving quietly so he wouldn't wake Cora. He checked the spare bedrooms. Empty. Dust on the floors. No sign anyone had been in them for months. He checked the storage room. Same thing. His chest tightened. He grabbed his coat and pulled it on, then shoved his feet into his boots and stepped outside into the freezing night. The wind hit him like a wall, driving snow into his face. He pulled his hat down and moved across the yard toward the barn, his breath steaming in the air. The barn was dark. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the smell hit him immediately. Hay and horses and leather, familiar and grounding. He grabbed the lantern hanging by the door and lit it, holding it high. The horses shifted in their stalls, huffing softly. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing the stacked hay bales, the saddles hanging on the wall, the tools lined up in neat rows. And then he saw her. Mei Lian was curled up in the corner on a pile of old blankets, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself. She was still wearing the gray dress. No coat, no shoes, just the thin fabric and a single threadbare quilt pulled over her shoulders. She looked up when the light fell on her eyes wide and startled, like an animal caught in a trap. Silas stood frozen, the lantern shaking in his hand. She was sleeping in the barn. In the goddamn barn, like livestock. The cold here was brutal, 20 degrees colder than the house, easy. The wind cut through the cracks in the walls. The floor was dirt and straw. She had no stove, no heat, nothing but those ragged blankets and whatever warmth she could steal from the horses. And she'd been doing this for 4 months. Shame crashed over him so hard it nearly buckled his knees. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice raw. Mei Lian scrambled to her feet, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her lips faintly blue. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her eyes dropping to the floor. Silas crossed the barn in 3 strides and grabbed her arm, not rough, but firm. "Inside," he said. "Now." She flinched, her whole body going rigid. I finish work," she stammered. "I come back." "You're not coming back. You're done sleeping out here." Her eyes lifted to his, confused and frightened. "I know trouble," she said quickly. "I quiet. I stay. I don't give a damn how quiet you are. You're not sleeping in a barn like a goddamn animal." He turned and pulled her toward the door, and she stumbled after him, too shocked to resist. He blew out the lantern and hung it back on the hook, then led her across the yard and into the house. The warmth hit them both like a wave. Silas shut the door and turned to face her. She stood in the middle of the room, shivering, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide and dark and full of something he couldn't name: fear, confusion, maybe a little hope. He dragged a hand through his hair, trying to get his thoughts in order. "Why the hell didn't you say something?" She looked down at the floor. "You give me work," she said softly. "You give me food. I no complain. You've been freezing to death every night. I survive." The word hit him harder than it should have. Survive. That's all either of them had been doing. He turned away, his jaw tight, and walked to the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small but clean, with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the yard. It had been his wife's sewing room once. He hadn't opened the door in 2 years. He moved to the bed and stripped the dusty quilt off, shaking it out. Then he pulled a wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed and laid it across the mattress. Mei Lian appeared in the doorway, still clutching the thin quilt. "This is your room now," Silas said, his voice rough. "You sleep here. Not in the barn, not on the floor, here." She stared at him, her lips parted, her eyes shining. I cannot." "You can, and you will." He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough to see the exhaustion written in every line of her face. "You work hard," he said. "You take care of my niece. You keep this house running. The least I can do is give you a goddamn bed." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time he'd heard her voice break. Silas nodded once, then turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. 4 months. She'd been out there for 4 months, and he'd never even noticed. What the hell kind of man did that make him? He went to his own room and shut the door, but he didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl and the house creak. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than numbness. He felt shame. And underneath it, buried so deep he almost didn't recognize it, he felt something else. Anger. Not at her. At himself. The next morning, Silas woke before dawn and dressed in the cold dark. When he came into the kitchen, Mei Lian was already there, standing at the stove with her back to him, the smell of rice and fried eggs filling the air. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard him, and their eyes met for a second before she looked away. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. A few minutes later, she set a plate in front of him: eggs, rice, pickled vegetables, and a slice of toasted bread. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and turned back to the stove. They didn't talk about the barn, but something had shifted between them, subtle as a change in the wind. When Cora came stumbling into the kitchen an hour later, rubbing her eyes and yawning, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Mei Lian, you're still here!" Mei Lian smiled, a real smile, small and tentative but genuine. "I stay," she said. Cora threw her arms around Mei Lian's waist, and for a moment the woman stood frozen, her hands hovering uncertainly. Then, slowly, she lowered them and rested them on the child's shoulders. Silas watched from the table, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Something in his chest cracked open, just a little. Over the next few days, the house continued to change in small, almost invisible ways. Mei Lian still cooked and cleaned and worked from dawn to dusk, but now she moved differently. There was less fear in her steps, less hesitation. She started humming while she worked, soft, wordless melodies that drifted through the house like smoke. Cora followed her everywhere, chattering away in a mix of English and the handful of Chinese words she'd picked up. Mei Lian answered patiently, teaching her how to fold dumplings, how to braid hair, how to say good morning, and thank you, and I love you. Silas kept his distance, but he watched. He noticed the way Mei Lian's hands moved when she cooked, quick and precise, like a dancer. He noticed the way she tilted her head when Cora asked a question, listening with her whole body. He noticed the faint scar on her wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, and wondered how she'd gotten it. He noticed her. One evening, after Cora had gone to bed, Silas sat by the fire with a book he wasn't reading and a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. Mei Lian was at the table, mending one of Cora's dresses by lamplight, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" he asked suddenly. She looked up, startled. "My mother," she said after a moment. "She teach me. In Guangdong." "That where you're from?" She nodded. "How'd you end up here?" Her hands stilled. She stared down at the dress in her lap, her face unreadable. "I come with husband," she said quietly. "He work on railroad. We come for better life." "Where is he now?" The silence stretched so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. "He die," she said finally. 2 years ago. Accident in tunnel." Silas set his glass down. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "He not good man, but he my husband. I stay. Try to survive." There was that word again. Survive. "Why didn't you go back?" he asked. "To China?" She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw something fierce in her eyes. "No home to go back," she said. "No family, no money. I stay here. I work. I survive." Silas nodded slowly. He understood that. Survival wasn't noble. It wasn't brave. It was just what you did when everything else had been stripped away. "You don't have to just survive anymore," he said. Her eyes widened. "You've got a place here," he continued, his voice rough. "A real place, you understand?" She stared at him for a long moment, her needle forgotten in her hand. Then she nodded, just once. "I understand. Bam." The first snow of December came hard and fast, burying the ranch under 2 feet of white silence. Silas spent the day digging out paths to the barn and chopping wood, his breath steaming in the frigid air. By the time he came inside, his hands were numb, and his face felt like it had been scrubbed with ice. Mei Lian had soup waiting, thick and rich, full of noodles and vegetables and chunks of tender beef. He ate 3 bowls and still wanted more. Cora sat across from him, swinging her legs and chattering about the snow fort she wanted to build. "Can Mei Lian help?" she asked. Silas glanced at the woman standing by the stove. "If she wants to." Mei Lian looked over, surprised. "I never see snow," she admitted. "Not like this." "Then you'd better get out there before it melts," Silas said. Cora let out a whoop and bolted for the door. The next hour was chaos. Cora and Mei Lian bundled up in coats and scarves and stumbled out into the yard, laughing and slipping on the ice. Silas watched from the porch, his arms crossed, trying not to smile. Mei Lian moved through the snow like a deer, light and cautious, her eyes wide with wonder. Cora showed her how to pack a snowball, and within minutes they were pelting each other, shrieking with laughter. At one point, Cora threw a snowball that went wide and hit Silas square in the chest. He froze. Cora's face went white. Then Silas bent down, scooped up a handful of snow, and fired it back. It hit Cora in the shoulder, and she screamed with delight. The battle was on. For 20 minutes, the 3 of them ran and dodged and threw snow like children, their breath fogging the air, their cheeks red with cold. Mei Lian's laughter rang out clear and bright, and it was the most beautiful sound Silas had heard in years. When they finally stumbled back inside, soaked and freezing and exhausted, Mei Lian made hot tea, and they sat by the fire, their wet clothes steaming, their faces glowing. Cora fell asleep in Silas's lap, her head heavy against his chest. Mei Lian sat across from him, cradling her cup of tea, her eyes soft. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For this." She gestured around the room. "For home." Silas looked at her, and something shifted in his chest. Home. He hadn't thought of this place as home in a long time, but maybe it could be again. By mid-December, the cold had settled in like a living thing, wrapping the ranch in silence and ice. Silas rode out every morning to check the cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs and hauling feed through drifts that came up to his knees. The work was brutal, but it kept him moving, kept him from thinking too much. Mei Lian kept the house warm. Not just physically, though the stove was always burning and the air smelled like ginger and garlic and fresh bread, but in other ways. She sang while she worked, soft Chinese lullabies that wound through the rooms like ribbons. She taught Cora how to write her name in Chinese characters. She mended Silas's shirts without being asked and left them folded on his bed. She was everywhere and nowhere, a quiet presence that filled the empty spaces. And Silas found himself noticing her more and more. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way her eyes crinkled at the corners when Cora said something funny. The way she moved through the kitchen like water, effortless and graceful. One night, he came in late from the barn and found her sitting at the table, writing by lamplight. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment their eyes met. "What are you writing?" he asked. She hesitated, then turned the paper so he could see. It was covered in Chinese characters, elegant and precise. "Letter," she said, "to friend, in San Francisco." "You have friends there?" "One. Woman I meet on ship. She write to me sometimes." Silas nodded and moved to the stove, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "You miss it?" he asked. "San Francisco?" She was quiet for a moment. "I miss having people," she said finally. "People who speak my language, who understand." "Must be lonely." She looked at him, her eyes dark and steady. "Not so much now," she said. Something in her voice made his throat tighten. He turned away and drank his coffee, staring into the fire. "You're not alone here," he said quietly. "I know." The silence stretched between them, warm and heavy. Then Mei Lian stood and gathered her letter, folding it carefully. "Good night, Silas." It was the first time she'd used his name. "Good night." She disappeared down the hall, and he stood there for a long time, the coffee cooling in his hands, wondering when the hell this had stopped being just about survival. Christmas came and went in a blur of snow and firelight. Silas hadn't planned on celebrating, hadn't celebrated anything in 2 years. But Cora had other ideas. She and Mei Lian spent a week making decorations out of scraps of fabric and dried berries, stringing them across the mantel and the windows. On Christmas morning, Silas woke to find a small pine tree in the corner of the main room, decorated with paper stars and strips of red cloth. Cora was vibrating with excitement. "Mei Lian helped me," she announced. "Do you like it?" Silas looked at the tree, then at Mei Lian, who stood in the doorway with flour on her apron and a shy smile on her face. "It's perfect," he said. They spent the day inside, warm and safe, while the wind howled outside. Mei Lian made a feast: roasted chicken, sweet potatoes, rice with vegetables, and a cake that tasted like honey and almonds. They ate until they couldn't move, and then Cora opened the small wooden horse Silas had carved for her and the cloth doll Mei Lian had sewn. She cried with happiness, and Silas felt something crack open inside him all over again. That night, after Cora had gone to bed, Silas and Mei Lian sat by the fire in comfortable silence. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For making today matter." She looked at him, her eyes soft in the firelight. "You give me home," she said quietly. "I give you this." Silas wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that she'd done more than that she'd brought life back into a house that had been dead, that she'd made him feel something other than empty. But the words wouldn't come. So he just nodded, and they sat together in the firelight, and for the first time in years, Silas felt something close to peace. The peace didn't last. It never did. The first crack came in early January, when Silas rode into town for supplies. Blackthorn wasn't much. A collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single muddy street, a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of houses. Most of the folks who lived there were ranchers or miners, hard people scratching out a hard living in a hard land. Silas tied his horse outside the general store and went inside, nodding to the clerk behind the counter. "Silas," the man said. His name was Emmett Grove, and he'd been running the store for as long as Silas could remember. "What can I get you?" "Flour, sugar, coffee, whatever dried beans you've got." Emmett started pulling items off the shelves, stacking them on the counter. How's that niece of yours doing? He asked. Good. She's doing real good. Heard you hired yourself some help out at the ranch. Silas went still. Yeah, a cook. Emmett didn't look up. Chinese woman, right? That's right. Huh. Emmett set a sack of flour on the counter with a thud. Didn't know you were the charitable type. Silas's jaw tightened. She works for her keep. Nothing charitable about it. Sure. Emmett's tone was light, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. Just seems a little unusual. You living out there alone with a foreign woman and a little girl. Silas leaned forward, his hands flat on the counter. You got something you want to say, Emmett? The clerk finally looked up, and his eyes were cold. I'm just saying folks talk, that's all. Let them talk. Silas paid for the supplies, loaded them onto his horse, and rode out of town without another word. But the whole way home, Emmett's words echoed in his head. Folks talk. And in a town like Blackthorn, talk could be as dangerous as a loaded gun. The ride back from town felt longer than it should have. Silas kept Emmett's words at bay by focusing on the rhythm of the horse beneath him, the creak of leather, the bite of cold air against his face. But the moment he crested the final rise and saw the ranch house below, smoke curling from the chimney into the gray sky, those words came rushing back. Folks talk. He'd lived in Blackthorn long enough to know what that meant. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, reputation was currency. A man's word was his bond, and a woman's virtue was her value. The rules were simple, unforgiving, and carved into the bedrock of frontier life, and he'd just broken one of them. Silas unsaddled his horse and hauled the supplies into the house. The warmth hit him immediately, along with the smell of something savory simmering on the stove. Cora was at the table, bent over a book, her tongue poking out in concentration. Mei Lian stood at the counter, chopping vegetables with quick, precise movements. She looked up when he entered, and her face brightened. You back? She said. I'm back. He set the sacks down and shrugged out of his coat. Cora glanced up from her book and waved absently before returning to whatever story had captured her attention. Silas moved to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee, watching Mei Lian work. She'd rolled her sleeves up to her elbows, and he could see the faint scar on her wrist again, a thin white line against her skin. Her hands moved with the kind of grace that came from years of practice, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time, what her life had been like before she'd ended up here. Something wrong? She asked, not looking up from the cutting board. No, why? You quiet, more than usual. He almost smiled. Just tired. She nodded and swept the chopped vegetables into the pan, where they hissed and sizzled. The smell of garlic and ginger filled the air, and Silas felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Town okay? She asked. Town's fine. He didn't tell her about Emmett, didn't tell her that people were already starting to notice her, to wonder about her, to turn her presence into something ugly. There was no point. She had enough to worry about without carrying his burdens too. But as he watched her cook, as he listened to Cora hum softly to herself at the table, he realized something that should have been obvious from the start. This wasn't going to stay quiet. People were going to talk. They were going to judge. And sooner or later, that judgment was going to find its way to his door. The question was what he was going to do about it. That night, after Cora had gone to bed and Mei Lian had finished the washing, Silas sat by the fire with a glass of whiskey and stared into the flames. He could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes, the whisper of her footsteps on the floorboards. A few minutes later, she appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel. You want tea? She asked. I'm fine. She hesitated, then crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from him. It was unusual. Normally, she disappeared into her room the moment the work was done, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space. But tonight, she stayed. You worried, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Silas turned the glass in his hands, watching the firelight catch in the amber liquid. Yeah. About me. He looked up sharply. No. About people being idiots. She tilted her head, studying him. People always idiots, she said. Especially about people like me. Now that doesn't make it right. No. But it make it true. Silas set the glass down on the table beside him. You ever think about leaving? he asked. Going somewhere else? Somewhere people might be less stupid? He huffed out something that might have been a laugh. Yeah, stupid. Mei Lian was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. I think about it, she said finally. But where I go, San Francisco maybe. But there, I just one more Chinese woman. No job, no home. Same as before. You got skills. You could find work. Maybe. Or maybe I end up in place worse than barn. The words hit him harder than they should have. You're not going back to the barn, he said, his voice rough. And you're not leaving unless you want to. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them that he couldn't name. Why you do this? She asked softly. Why you care? Silas didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but he wasn't ready to say it out loud. Because it's the right thing to do, he said instead. She smiled, small and sad. Right thing, often hardest thing. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. And Silas realized that this quiet, this warmth, this sense of not being alone, was something he hadn't felt in years, and he wasn't ready to give it up. The storm came 3 days later, roaring down from the mountains with the fury of something alive and angry. The wind hit the ranch like a fist, rattling the shutters and tearing at the roof. Snow fell so thick Silas couldn't see 10 feet past the porch. He spent the morning battening down everything he could and moving the cattle closer to the shelter of the trees. By the time he stumbled back to the house, his face was raw and his hands were numb inside his gloves. Mei Lian met him at the door with a towel and a cup of hot tea. You crazy, she said, shaking her head. You freeze out there. Cattle would have frozen faster. She muttered something in Chinese that he was pretty sure wasn't complimentary and herded him toward the fire. Cora looked up from the rug where she was playing with her wooden horse and gasped. Uncle Silas, your face is all red. I'm fine, kid. You don't look fine. Mei Lian pressed the tea into his hands and disappeared into the kitchen. A moment later, she returned with a basin of warm water and a cloth. She knelt beside his chair and reached for his face. He pulled back instinctively. I can do it. You do bad job, she said firmly. Hold still. She dabbed the cloth against his cheeks, her touch light and careful. Her face was close to his, close enough that he could see the faint gold flecks in her dark eyes, the way her lashes cast shadows on her skin. His breath caught. You take stupid risks, she murmured, not looking at him. Someone's got to. Someone also got to stay alive. I'll keep that in mind. She pulled back, wringing out the cloth, and for a moment their eyes met. Something flickered in her expression, something soft and uncertain, and then it was gone. I make soup, she said, standing quickly. You eat. Get warm. She disappeared into the kitchen, and Silas sat there, his heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. Cora climbed into his lap, still clutching her wooden horse. Do you like Mei Lian? She asked. Silas nearly choked on his tea. What kind of question is that? A regular question. Cora tilted her head, her dark eyes too knowing for a 7-year-old. I like her. She's nice. And she makes good food. And she tells good stories. She does all those things. So do you like her? Silas set the cup down and wrapped his arms around his niece, pulling her close. Yeah, kid. I like her. Good. Cora snuggled against his chest. I think she likes you too. Silas didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing at all. The storm lasted 3 days. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow piled so high against the house that Silas had to dig a path to the barn every morning just to feed the horses. The world beyond the ranch disappeared into a wall of white, and the three of them were trapped inside together, riding out the storm like sailors on a ship. It should have felt claustrophobic. Instead, it felt like something else entirely. Mei Lian cooked and cleaned and sang her quiet songs. Cora played and read and chattered endlessly, filling the house with noise and life. And Silas found himself watching them both, memorizing the way Mei Lian's face softened when Cora laughed, the way her hands moved when she kneaded dough, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. He was in dangerous territory, and he knew it, but he didn't pull back. On the third night of the storm, Cora fell asleep on the rug by the fire, her book still open beside her. Mei Lian covered her with a blanket and started to lift her, but Silas waved her off. "I've got her." He scooped Cora up, cradling her against his chest, and carried her to her room. She didn't wake, just sighed and burrowed deeper into his arms. He laid her down gently, pulled the blankets up to her chin, and stood there for a moment, watching her sleep. She looked like her father. Same dark hair, same stubborn chin, but she had her mother's gentleness, her mother's laugh. Silas's throat tightened. He'd failed his brother, failed his sister-in-law, but he'd be damned if he'd fail this little girl. When he came back into the main room, Mei Lian was standing by the window, looking out into the storm. The firelight caught in her hair, turning it almost blue-black, and for a moment she looked like something out of a dream. "Storm bad," she said quietly. "Yeah. You think it stops soon?" "Hope so. Running low on feed for the horses." She turned to face him, and her expression was serious. "Silas, what happened when storm over?" "What do you mean?" "You go to town again. People talk more. They see me. They think bad things." He crossed the room and stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to see the worry in her eyes. "Let them think what they want. But they hurt you. Hurt Cora. Because of me. No one's going to hurt Cora." "You sure?" He wasn't, but he couldn't tell her that. "I'll handle it," he said instead. "How?" "I don't know yet." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he didn't expect. She reached out and touched his hand. It was brief, barely a second, her fingertips brushing against his knuckles, but it was enough to send a jolt through him like lightning. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trying." Then she pulled back and disappeared down the hall, leaving him standing there alone with the ghost of her touch still burning against his skin. The storm broke the next morning. Silas woke to silence, and when he stepped outside, the world was blinding white and achingly beautiful. The sun was out, the sky was clear, and the snow sparkled like a field of diamonds. He spent the day digging out, clearing paths, checking the animals. Everything had survived. The ranch was intact. They'd made it through. But as he worked, his mind kept circling back to the same thought. The storm was over, which meant he'd have to go back to town eventually, and when he did, the reckoning would come. 2 weeks later, Silas made the trip. The roads were still rough but passable, and he needed supplies. More than that, he needed to show his face, to remind people that he was still there, still standing, still in control of his own land. He rode into Blackthorn just after noon, tied his horse outside the general store, and stepped inside. Emmett was behind the counter again, and this time he wasn't alone. 2 other men stood near the stove, warming their hands and talking in low voices. They looked up when Silas entered, and the conversation died. "Silas," Emmett said, his tone carefully neutral. "Back again. Need more flour and salt." Emmett nodded and started pulling items off the shelves. The 2 men by the stove didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him with cold, measuring eyes. Silas recognized one of them. Frank Dolan, a rancher who lived about 10 miles south. The other was a stranger, tall and thin with a face like a hatchet. "Heard you had quite a storm out your way," Frank said. "We did." "Everyone make it through okay?" "Everyone's fine." "That include your little Chinaman?" The word hit the air like a slap. Silas turned slowly, his jaw tight. "I don't have a Chinaman. I have a cook. And yes, she's fine." Frank's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Cook." "Right. That what we're calling it now?" The stranger laughed, a low, ugly sound. Silas took a step forward. "You got something you want to say to me, Frank?" "I'm just saying it's a little unusual is all. You living out there with a foreign woman and a little girl. People wonder. People should mind their own business. Hard to do that when you're making it everyone's business." "How the hell am I doing that?" Frank crossed his arms. "You're setting a bad example, Silas. Folks in this town got standards, got values. We don't take kindly to men who bring in heathen women and parade them around like they're decent." Silas's hands curled into fists. "She is decent. More decent than half the people in this town." "She's Chinese." So? So she don't belong here." The words hung in the air, flat and final. Silas stared at Frank Dolan, at his smug, self-righteous face, and felt something snap inside him. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. That woman works harder in a day than you've worked in your entire sorry life. She's kept my house running, she's taken care of my niece, and she's done it without asking for a damn thing in return. So if you've got a problem with her, you've got a problem with me." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Silas. You keep talking like that. People might start thinking you've gone soft. Or worse. I don't give a damn what people think. You should, because it ain't just you anymore. You got that little girl to think about." The mention of Cora sent a spike of cold fear through Silas's chest. "What about her?" Frank shrugged. "Just saying, people talk. And when people talk long enough, sometimes things happen. Social services might start wondering if you're a fit guardian, especially with the kind of company you're keeping." Silas crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and grabbed Frank by the front of his shirt, slamming him back against the wall. The stranger yelped and scrambled backward, and Emmett shouted something from behind the counter. "You threaten my family again," Silas said, his voice shaking with rage, "and I will put you in the ground. You understand me?" Frank's face had gone white, but his eyes were still hard. "You just proved my point," he said. Silas shoved him away and turned, stalking toward the door. He didn't look at Emmett, didn't acknowledge the stranger, just walked out into the cold and untied his horse. His hands were shaking. He rode out of town at a gallop, the wind burning his face, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. They were coming for him, coming for Cora, and it was all because of Mei Lian. No, it wasn't because of her. It was because of them, because of their fear, their ignorance, their goddamn self-righteous cruelty. But the result was the same. He was going to lose everything, unless he did something about it. When he got back to the ranch, Mei Lian was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred something on the stove. Cora was at the table drawing with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of paper. They both looked up when he came in, and Mei Lian's smile faltered. "What wrong?" she asked. "Nothing." "You lie." Silas set his hat on the peg and crossed to the fire, staring into the flames. "Silas." Her voice was quiet but firm. "What happened?" He turned to face her, and the words came out before he could stop them. "They know about you, the whole town, and they're not happy." Her face went pale. "They say something?" "They said a lot of things." "Like what?" "Doesn't matter." "It mattered to me." Silas dragged a hand through his hair, his jaw tight. "They think you don't belong here. They think I'm making a mistake keeping you, and they threaten to take Cora away if I don't get rid of you." The silence that followed was deafening. Mei Lian stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the stove. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "Then I go," she said quietly. "What?" "I leave. Tonight. You keep Cora. You keep ranch. I go." "Like hell you will." "You have no choice. I have every choice." He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, his voice shaking. "You're not leaving. I'm not letting them win." "This is not about winning." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "This about Cora. You lose her because of me. You never forgive yourself. I never forgive myself." "I'm not losing anyone." "You are. You just too stubborn to see it." Cora's voice cut through the argument like a knife. "Stop yelling!" They both turned. Cora was standing by the table, her face crumpled, tears running down her cheeks. "Stop yelling at each other," she sobbed. "I don't want Mei Lian to leave. I don't want her to go." Silas's chest ached. He crossed the room and knelt in front of his niece, pulling her into his arms. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice rough. "I promise." "You promise?" "I promise." Cora buried her face in his shoulder, and Silas looked up at Mei Lian over the top of her head. She was standing by the stove, her arms wrapped around herself, her face streaked with tears. And in that moment, Silas made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right one, didn't know if it would work, but he knew he couldn't keep living like this, caught between what was right and what was safe. He had to choose, and he chose them. That night, after Cora had finally cried herself to sleep and the house was quiet, Silas found Mei Lian sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, staring out at the dark. He sat down beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "For what?" For causing trouble. For making your life hard. You didn't make anything hard. They did. She shook her head. If you weren't here, this house would still be dead. Cora would still be half wild with grief. And I'd still be a ghost. He turned to look at her. You brought us back to life. Don't apologize for that. Her breath hitched. What we do now? I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Together? He reached out and took her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. Yeah, he said quietly. Together. They sat there in the cold, their hands clasped, the stars burning overhead. And for the first time since the storm had passed, Silas felt something other than fear. He felt hope. Hope was a fragile thing, and Silas knew better than to trust it. But sitting there on the porch with Mei Lian's hand in his, feeling the warmth of her pulse against his palm, he let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe they could survive this. The cold drove them inside eventually. Mei Lian pulled her hand away gently, murmuring something about banking the stove, and disappeared into the kitchen. Silas stayed on the porch a few minutes longer, staring out at the darkness, trying to figure out what the hell his next move should be. Frank Dolan's words kept circling through his mind like vultures. Social services might start wondering if you're a fit guardian. It wasn't an idle threat. In a territory where law was still being written and rewritten, where judges held court in saloons and decisions could hinge on nothing more than a man's reputation, losing Cora was a real possibility. All it would take was the right person filing the right complaint, and some circuit judge passing through town could decide that Silas Vane was unfit to raise a child. And then what? They'd take her away. Send her back east to some orphanage or distant relative who'd never known her, never loved her, never understood what it meant to grow up wild and free under a Wyoming sky, over his dead body. Silas went inside and locked the door behind him. The house was warm and quiet, the fire burning low. He could hear Mei Lian moving around in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes, the whisper of her footsteps. He found her at the basin, washing the last of the dinner plates. She didn't look up when he entered, just kept scrubbing, her movements mechanical. You should get some sleep, he said. Soon. Mei Lian. She set the plate down and turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. I've been thinking, she said quietly. About what? About leaving, really leaving, not just talk. His chest tightened. I told you. I know what you told me, but you also tell me about town, about what they say, about Cora. She wrapped her arms around herself, her voice trembling. I cannot be reason you lose her. I cannot. Silas crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. You're not the reason for anything. Those people out there, they're looking for someone to blame because their own lives are small and mean, and they can't stand the thought of anyone being happy. That's not on you. But if you're not here, they'll find something else. Someone else. That's what people like that do. His grip tightened. I'm not letting you run just because some coward made a threat. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Then what we do? We fight. How? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Reassurance, certainty, maybe just the courage to believe him. You promise? She whispered. I promise. She nodded, and he released her shoulders. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and turned back to the basin, but her movements were slower now, less certain. Silas left her there and went to his room, but sleep didn't come. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through possibilities and discarding them one by one. He could ignore the threats, pretend nothing had happened, but that wouldn't stop people from talking, and talk had a way of turning into action when enough of it piled up. He could confront the town council directly, demand they leave him alone, but that would just make him look defensive, guilty, like he had something to hide. He could send Mei Lian away, keep her safe by keeping her distant, but the thought of that made his chest ache so badly he couldn't breathe. No, there had to be another way, and somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, he found it. The next morning, Silas woke with a plan forming in his mind. It was risky. Hell, it was damn near insane, but it was the only thing he could think of that might actually work. He dressed quickly and went into the kitchen. Mei Lian was already there, her hair still loose around her shoulders, stirring oatmeal on the stove. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression made her stop. "What?" she asked. "I need to go back to town." Her face paled. "Why?" "Because sitting here waiting for them to come after us isn't going to work. I need to take control of this before they do." "What you gonna do?" "Talk to Judge Harlow." Mei Lian set the spoon down, her hands trembling. "Judge? Why?" "Because if Frank Dolan's serious about going after my guardianship, he'll have to take it to a judge eventually. I'd rather get there first." "And say what?" Silas leaned against the counter, his jaw set. "The truth. That you work for me. That you're a good person. That anyone who says otherwise is full of horse shit." "They not listen." "Maybe not, but I have to try." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes dark and afraid. "You take risk for me," she said softly. "Why?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years he let himself say what he'd been feeling for weeks. "Because you matter, to Cora, to me. And I'm not letting anyone take that away." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Cora's voice rang out from the hallway. "Is breakfast ready? I'm starving." The spell broke. Mei Lian turned back to the stove, her cheeks flushed, and Silas went to get his coat. 2 hours later, he was riding back into Blackthorn. The town looked the same as it always did. Weathered buildings, muddy streets, a handful of people moving through the cold with their heads down and their collars up. But now Silas saw it differently. Now he saw the judgment in every turned head, the suspicion in every sideways glance. He tied his horse outside the courthouse, a squat wooden building that doubled as the town hall, and went inside. Judge Harlow was at his desk, bent over a stack of papers, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. He was a thin man in his 60s, with a lined face and gray hair that stuck up in odd directions. He looked up when Silas entered and raised an eyebrow. "Silas Vane. Didn't expect to see you today." "Need to talk to you, Judge." Harlow gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. What's on your mind?" Silas sat and took off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I want to make sure my guardianship of Cora is secure." Harlow leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Why wouldn't it be?" "Because people are talking, and when people talk long enough, they start causing problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind where someone decides I'm not fit to raise her." Harlow was quiet for a moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This have anything to do with the woman you hired?" Silas's jaw tightened. "Her name is Mei Lian. And yes, she Chinese? She is. And she's living in your house. She works for me. She cooks, cleans, takes care of Cora, same as any housekeeper. Except most housekeepers aren't foreign women living under the same roof as a single man and a little girl. Most housekeepers aren't as good at their job as she is either." Harlow sighed and took off his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Silas, I'm going to be straight with you. I've heard the talk, and it's not good. People are concerned. They think it's improper, immoral, even. People can think what they want. It doesn't change the fact that she's done nothing wrong. I believe you, but belief doesn't matter much when it comes to public opinion." Harlow set his spectacles down on the desk. "If someone files a complaint, and I'm guessing Frank Dolan's already considering it, I'll have to take it seriously. There'll be a hearing, witnesses, questions, and if the wrong people show up and say the wrong things, I might not have a choice." Silas leaned forward, his hands gripping the brim of his hat so hard his knuckles turned white. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to be smart about this. Give people less to talk about. Send the woman away, or at least make it clear there's nothing improper going on." "There isn't anything improper going on." "Then prove it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Silas stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you for your time, Judge." Harlow watched him go, his expression unreadable. "Be careful, Silas. You're walking a thin line." "I've been walking thin lines my whole life." He left the courthouse and stood on the street, breathing hard, his mind racing. Prove it. How the hell was he supposed to prove something that should have been obvious? How was he supposed to make people see Mei Lian the way he did, as a person, not a problem? And then, standing there in the cold with the wind cutting through his coat, the answer hit him. There was one way. One way to make it absolutely clear that Mei Lian wasn't just some woman he'd taken in out of pity or lust or whatever the hell people thought. One way to silence the talk, protect Cora, and keep his family together. It was insane. It was terrifying. And it was the only option he had left. When Silas got back to the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He unsaddled his horse and stood in the barn for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to work up the courage to do what he knew had to be done. Inside, the house was warm and bright. Mei Lian was at the stove, as always, and Cora was setting the table, chattering about something that had happened with the chickens. They both looked up when he came in, and Mei Lian's smile faded. "What happened?" she asked. "We need to talk. After dinner." Her face went pale, but she nodded. Dinner was quiet. Silas barely tasted the food, and Mei Lian ate even less than usual. Cora seemed to sense the tension and kept glancing between them, her eyes worried. When the meal was over and the dishes were washed, Silas sent Cora to bed early. She protested, but one look at his face silenced her. She hugged Mei Lian goodnight and disappeared down the hall, leaving the two of them alone. Mei Lian sat down at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale. "You talked to Judge," she said quietly. "I did." "What'd he say?" Silas sat down across from her, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "He said if someone files a complaint, there will be a hearing, and if enough people show up and say the wrong things, I could lose Cora." Mei Lian closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping. "Then I leave. Tonight. No." Her eyes snapped open. "Silas, I'm not letting you leave, and I'm not letting them take Cora." He took a deep breath. "But there is one thing we can do. One way to make this all go away." "What?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and said the words that would change everything. "We get married." The silence that followed was deafening. Mei Lian stared at him, her eyes wide, her mouth open. "What?" she whispered. "We get married. Tomorrow. I'll take you into town, we'll go to the courthouse, and we'll get a marriage license, right there in front of everyone." He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "If you're my wife, they can't say anything. They can't call you improper or immoral or any of the other garbage they've been throwing around. You'll be protected, Cora will be protected, and they'll have to shut the hell up." Mei Lian was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "You crazy. You not think straight. I'm thinking straighter than I have in years. You not want marry me. You just want protect Cora. I want both." She stood abruptly, backing away from the table. "No, I cannot let you do this. You sacrifice too much. Your reputation, My reputation doesn't mean a damn thing if I lose my family." "I'm not your family." "Yes, you are." The words came out louder than he intended, echoing through the house. Mei Lian flinched, and Silas stood, crossing to her. "You are my family," he said, his voice rough. "You and Cora, you're all I have, and I'm not losing you, either of you." Mei Lian was crying in earnest now, her whole body shaking. "You not love me," she whispered. "This not real marriage." Silas reached out and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Maybe it's not. Not yet. But it could be. If you give it a chance. If you trust me." She searched his eyes, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "You really want this?" she asked. "I really want this." "Why?" "Because I can't imagine this house without you anymore. Because Cora loves you. Because I—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Because I care about you. More than I thought I could care about anyone ever again." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time they were different, softer. "What if I say yes and people still hate us?" she whispered. "Then let them hate us. Together." She stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Relief crashed through him so hard his knees nearly buckled. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and she clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. "Thank you," he murmured into her hair. "You crazy man," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "But I say yes." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, and for the first time in weeks, Silas felt like maybe, just maybe, they were going to survive this. That night, neither of them slept much. Silas lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong. Mei Lian stayed in her room, but he could hear her moving around, restless, probably just as terrified as he was. When morning came, he dressed in his best shirt and jacket, the ones he'd worn to his brother's funeral, and knocked on her door. "You ready?" There was a long pause, and then the door opened. Mei Lian stood there in a dark blue dress he'd never seen before, her hair pinned up, her face pale but determined. "I ready," she said. Cora appeared in the hallway, rubbing her eyes. "Where are you going?" Silas knelt down and took her by the shoulders. "We're going into town. And when we come back, Mei Lian's going to be part of this family. For real." Cora's eyes went wide. "You mean like a mama?" Silas glanced up at Mei Lian, who was staring at Cora with an expression of such raw hope it made his chest ache. "Yeah, kid. Like a mama." Cora let out a squeal and launched herself at Mei Lian, wrapping her arms around her waist. Mei Lian caught her, holding her close, tears streaming down her face. "You want that?" she whispered. "You want me?" "Of course I want you." Cora pulled back, beaming. "You make the best dumplings in the whole world." Mei Lian laughed, a broken, beautiful sound, and kissed the top of Cora's head. Silas stood and cleared his throat. "Come on, let's go before I lose my nerve." The ride into town felt like the longest of Silas's life. Cora sat in front of him on the saddle, bouncing with excitement, while Mei Lian rode beside them on the spare horse, her face set and her hands tight on the reins. They didn't talk. There was nothing left to say. When they reached Blackthorn, Silas tied the horses outside the courthouse and helped Mei Lian down. Her hands were ice cold, and she was trembling. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes, I do," she said. "For Cora, for you, for me." He nodded and took her hand. Together, with Cora between them, they walked into the courthouse. Judge Harlow looked up from his desk when they entered, and his eyebrows shot up. "Silas, didn't expect to see you again so soon." I need a marriage license." Harlow's gaze shifted to Mei Lian, then back to Silas. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he stood and pulled a ledger from the shelf behind him. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure." Harlow opened the ledger and dipped his pen in the inkwell. "Names?" "Silas Vane and Mei Lian." He paused, realizing he didn't know her last name. He looked down at her. "What's your last name?" "Chen," she said softly. "Mei Lian Chen." Harlow wrote it down, his pen scratching across the page. When he finished, he looked up. "I'll need 2 witnesses." Silas's jaw tightened. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Before he could figure out what to do, the door to the courthouse opened and Emmett Grove walked in. He stopped dead when he saw them, his eyes going wide. "Silas? What the hell are you doing?" "Getting married. You willing to be a witness?" Emmett stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're serious." "Dead serious." Emmett looked at Mei Lian, then at Cora, then back at Silas. Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been respect, or maybe just resignation. "All right," he said finally. "I'll witness." Harlow cleared his throat. "I'll need one more." The door opened again, and to Silas's shock, Frank Dolan walked in. He stopped when he saw them, his face darkening. "What the hell is this?" "Mr. Dolan," Harlow said mildly. "Perfect timing. I need another witness." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Witness for what?" "A marriage." Frank looked at Silas, then at Mei Lian, and his face twisted with disgust. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm not asking you to approve," Silas said, his voice hard. "I'm just asking you to sign a piece of paper." "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll find someone else, but you'll still have to live with the fact that I didn't back down." Frank stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then he crossed the room and grabbed the pen from Harlow's hand. "Fine. Let's get this over with." Harlow read the words quickly, the legal language washing over them like cold water. When he finished, he looked at Silas. "Do you, Silas Vane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Silas looked down at Mei Lian, at her pale face and her trembling hands, and he squeezed her fingers. "I do." And do you, Mei Lianchen, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Mei Lian's voice was barely a whisper. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife. It was done. Emmett and Frank signed the ledger, neither of them saying a word. Harlow handed Silas a copy of the license, and just like that, they were married. Frank turned and walked out without a backward glance. Emmett lingered for a moment, then nodded once and left as well. Silas stood there, holding the marriage license, his heart pounding. Cora tugged on his sleeve. Are we going home now? He looked down at her, then at Mei Lian, and he nodded. Yeah, kid. We're going home. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold morning air, and the world felt different. The sun was higher now, cutting through the clouds, and the street was busier. People moving between buildings, wagons rolling past, the sound of hammers ringing from the blacksmith shop down the way, and every single person stopped to stare. Silas felt Mei Lian stiffen beside him, her hand tightening around his. He didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her closer, making it clear to everyone watching that she was his wife now, and anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with him directly. They made it to the horses without incident, but Silas could feel the weight of those stares like hands pressing against his back. Cora seemed oblivious, skipping along beside them, chattering about what they should have for dinner to celebrate. Can we have dumplings? And that sweet rice cake Mei Lian makes? And, oh, can I stay up late? We'll see, Silas said, lifting her onto the saddle. He helped Mei Lian onto her horse, and their eyes met for just a second. She looked terrified and exhilarated all at once, like someone who'd just jumped off a cliff and wasn't sure if she'd fly or fall. You all right? He asked quietly. I not know yet, she whispered. He nodded and swung up onto his own horse. They rode out of town at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, and Silas kept his eyes forward, refusing to look back. The ride home was quieter than the ride in. Cora eventually stopped talking and dozed against his chest, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait. Mei Lian rode beside them in silence, her face turned away, watching the landscape roll past. When they finally crested the rise and the ranch came into view, Silas felt something in his chest loosen. The house looked solid and welcoming, smoke curling from the chimney, the barn standing sturdy against the wind. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. He glanced over at Mei Lian and found her staring at the house with an expression he couldn't quite read. What are you thinking? He asked. She was quiet for a long moment. I thinking this my home now, she said softly. For real. Not just place I work, not just place I sleep. Home. Yeah, he said. It is. They dismounted in the yard and Cora woke up long enough to stumble into the house, declaring she was going to draw a picture to celebrate. Silas and Mei Lian stood by the horses, suddenly alone, and the silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid. I should unsaddle the horses, Silas said. I should start dinner. Neither of them moved. Finally, Mei Lian stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She didn't say anything, just stood there, her palm warm through the fabric of his shirt, her eyes searching his face. Thank you, she whispered. You don't have to thank me. I do. You give me life I never think I have. You give me family. You give me... She trailed off, her voice breaking. You give me hope. Silas covered her hand with his own, holding it there. You gave me the same thing. They stood like that for a moment longer, the wind tugging at their clothes, the horses shifting restlessly beside them. Then Mei Lian pulled away, her cheeks flushed, and hurried toward the house. Silas watched her go, then turned to the horses, his heart pounding. He'd just married a woman he barely knew, in front of witnesses who hated them both, to protect a child who'd already lost too much. It should have felt wrong. It should have felt like a mistake. But it didn't. That night, the house felt different. Not in any obvious way. The rooms were the same, the furniture was the same. The fire crackled in the hearth the way it always did. But there was a new energy humming beneath the surface, something charged and uncertain, like the air before a storm. Dinner was a strange affair. Mei Lian had made a feast, dumplings, stir-fried vegetables, rice, and a chicken roasted with herbs that made Silas's mouth water. Cora ate until she couldn't move, then demanded the sweet rice cake she'd been promised. Mei Lian laughed and served her a small piece, and Cora declared it the best day of her entire life. When the meal was over and the dishes were washed, Cora hugged them both good night and disappeared into her room, still chattering about weddings and celebrations and how she was going to tell everyone at the general store next time they went to town. Silas and Mei Lian stood in the kitchen, the silence settling over them like a blanket. "I should go to bed," Mei Lian said finally, not meeting his eyes. "Yeah, me too." Neither of them moved. "Silas?" she said quietly. "What we do now?" "What do you mean?" "We married, but we not—" She gestured helplessly, her cheeks flushing. "We not really married, not like real husband and wife." Silas's throat went dry. "I know. You want me moved to your room, or you want—" "No." The word came out too fast, too harsh, and he softened his tone. "I mean, not yet. Not unless you want to. This doesn't have to be anything more than what you need it to be." She looked at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. "What you need it to be?" He dragged a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "I need you to feel safe. I need Cora to be protected. Everything else we can figure out as we go." She nodded slowly, but there was something in her expression that looked almost like disappointment. "Okay," she said softly. "We figure out." She turned and walked down the hall to her room, and Silas stood there in the kitchen, listening to the sound of her door closing, wondering if he'd just made the right choice or the biggest mistake of his life. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Outwardly, nothing changed. Mei Lian still cooked and cleaned, Silas still worked the ranch, Cora still chattered and played and filled the house with noise. But beneath the surface, everything was different. Mei Lian moved through the house with a new confidence, her shoulders straighter, her steps lighter. She didn't flinch when Silas came into her room. She didn't look away when their eyes met. And sometimes, late at night when he was lying in his bed staring at the ceiling, he'd hear her moving around in her room and wonder what she was thinking. Cora, for her part, seemed convinced that the marriage had solved all their problems. She started calling Mei Lian Mama, without prompting, and every time she did, Mei Lian's face would light up like the sun breaking through clouds. Silas found himself watching them more and more. Mei Lian braiding Cora's hair, Cora teaching Mei Lian a song she'd learned, the two of them laughing over something he didn't quite catch. They fit together so naturally, it was like they'd always been family. And he realized with a sharp pang that he was the outsider now. Not in a bad way, just in a way that reminded him how long he'd been alone. A week after the wedding, Silas rode into town again for supplies. He'd been putting it off, dreading the confrontation he knew was coming, but they were running low on flour and coffee, and he couldn't avoid it forever. The moment he tied his horse outside the general store, he felt the stares. People on the street stopped and watched him, their faces a mix of curiosity, judgment, and something that might have been pity. He ignored them and went inside. Emmett was behind the counter again, and this time his expression was carefully neutral. "Silas." "Emmett, what can I get you?" "Flour, coffee, sugar?" "Same as always." Emmett nodded and started pulling items from the shelves. The store was empty except for the two of them, and the silence was heavy. "How's married life treating you?" Emmett asked finally, not looking at him. "Fine." "That's good." Emmett set the supplies on the counter and tallied them up. Silas paid and started loading the sacks into his arms. "Silas," Emmett said quietly, "you should know. People are still talking." Silas stopped. "Let them talk." "It's not just talk anymore. Frank Dolan's been stirring things up. He's convinced half the town that you've lost your mind. Says you're setting a bad example for the children, bringing in foreign influences, undermining good Christian values." "I don't give a damn what Frank Dolan thinks." "Maybe you should, because he's not just complaining to his drinking buddies anymore. He's talking to the church council, and the town council, and anyone else who will listen." Silas set the sacks down on the counter, his jaw tight. "What's he trying to do?" "I don't know, but I don't think he's done making trouble for you." Silas stared at Emmett for a long moment, then nodded. "Thanks for the warning." He picked up the supplies and walked out, his mind racing. Frank Dolan wasn't going to let this go. He was the kind of man who saw compromise as weakness and forgiveness as cowardice. And now that Silas had openly defied him, had married Mei Lian in front of witnesses, Frank was going to do everything in his power to make him pay. The question was how. The answer came 2 weeks later, on a cold afternoon when the wind was blowing hard enough to rattle the shutters. Silas was in the barn, repairing a broken stall door, when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He set down the hammer and stepped outside, shading his eyes against the glare of the snow. 3 men were riding up the path toward the house. Silas recognized 2 of them immediately, Frank Dolan and Judge Harlow. The third was a stranger, a thin man in a dark suit carrying a leather satchel. Silas's stomach dropped. He walked across the yard to meet them, his boots crunching in the snow. Behind him, he heard the door to the house open. And he glanced back to see Mei Lian standing on the porch, her face pale. "Stay inside," he called. She didn't move. The men reined in their horses and Judge Harlow dismounted, his expression grim. "Silas." "Judge, what's this about?" Harlow gestured to the stranger. "This is Mr. Albert Gaines. He's with the Territorial Child Welfare Office." Silas's blood turned to ice. "The what?" "We've received a complaint," Gaines said, his voice clipped and officious, "regarding the welfare of a minor child in your care, a Miss Cora Vane." "A complaint from who?" Frank Dolan smiled, thin and cold. "From concerned citizens who believe that child is being raised in an environment unsuitable for a young girl." Silas took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. "You son of a—" "Silas," Harlow said sharply. "Let him speak." Gaines opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "According to the complaint, you are living with a foreign woman of questionable moral character, and this woman has undue influence over the child. There are also concerns about the child's education, her religious upbringing, and whether she is being properly cared for." "That's horseshit," Silas said, his voice shaking with rage. "Cora is healthy, happy, and loved. She's getting a better education here than she'd get in any school in this territory. And Mei Lian is my wife, not some woman of questionable character." "So you've said," Gaines replied, "but we need to verify these claims. I'm here to conduct an inspection of the household and interview the child." "The hell you are!" "Silas," Harlow's voice was low and urgent. "If you refuse, it'll only make things worse. Let him talk to Cora. Let him see the house. If everything's as good as you say it is, there won't be a problem." Silas stared at the judge, then at Gaines, then at Frank Dolan, who was still smiling that cold, satisfied smile. He wanted to throw them all off his property. Wanted to grab his rifle and tell them to get the hell out before he put holes in them. But that would only prove Frank right. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But you watch your tone around my daughter, and if you so much as upset her, I'm throwing you out. Understand?" Gaines nodded curtly. "Understood." Silas turned and walked toward the house, the men following behind him. Mei Lian was still on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, her face stricken. "What they want?" she whispered. "They want to inspect the house. Talk to Cora." He stopped in front of her, his voice low. "It's going to be fine. Just stay calm and answer their questions." She nodded, but her hands were shaking. They went inside, and Cora looked up from the rug where she was playing, her eyes widening when she saw the strangers. "Uncle Silas? Who are they?" "These men are here to ask you some questions, kid. Nothing to be scared of." Gaines crossed the room and knelt down in front of Cora, his expression softening slightly. "Hello, Cora. My name is Mr. Gaines. I just want to make sure you're happy and healthy. Is that all right?" Cora glanced at Silas, who nodded. "I guess," she said. Gaines smiled. "Can you tell me about your day? What do you do here on the ranch?" Cora launched into a detailed description of her morning, how she'd helped Mei Lian make breakfast, how she'd practiced her letters, how she'd gone outside to feed the chickens and play in the snow. Gaines listened, nodding and taking notes. "And this woman," he said, gesturing to Mei Lian. "She takes care of you?" "She's my mama now," Cora said proudly. "She teaches me things. And she makes the best food in the whole world." "Your mama," Gaines repeated, writing that down. "And your uncle. Does he spend time with you?" "All the time. He reads to me at night. And he carved me a horse for Christmas. And he lets me help with the ranch work sometimes, even though I'm just a kid." Gaines asked a few more questions about her education, her health, whether she felt safe. And Cora answered them all with the kind of cheerful honesty only a 7-year-old could muster. When he was done, Gaines stood and looked around the house. He walked through the rooms, inspecting the kitchen, the bedrooms, the main living area. He opened cupboards, checked the stove, looked at the beds. Silas followed him, his jaw so tight it ached. Finally, Gaines returned to the main room and closed his satchel. "The house is clean and well maintained," he said. "The child appears healthy, well-fed, and happy. Her education seems adequate for her age." "So we're done here?" Silas said. "Not quite." Gaines looked at Mei Lian. "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Vane, alone." Mei Lian's eyes went wide with fear. "No," Silas said. "It's part of the inspection, Mr. Vane. I need to speak with all members of the household. She doesn't speak English well. She won't understand half your questions." "Then we'll manage as best we can." Silas looked at Mei Lian, and she nodded, her face pale but determined. "Is okay," she said quietly. "I talked to him." Gaines led her into the kitchen, and Silas stood in the main room, his hands clenched into fists, listening to the low murmur of their voices. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the tremor in Mei Lian's voice, the hesitation. Cora climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Are they going to take me away?" she whispered. "No," he said fiercely. "No one's taking you anywhere." "Promise?" "I promise." After what felt like an eternity, Gaines and Mei Lian returned. She looked exhausted, her face drawn, but she nodded at Silas as if to say she was all right. Gaines turned to Judge Harlow and Frank Dolan, who had been standing near the door the entire time. "I've seen enough," he said. "The child is well cared for. The household is stable. I see no reason to remove her from Mr. Vane's guardianship at this time." Relief crashed through Silas so hard he nearly staggered. Frank Dolan's face darkened. "That's it? You're just going to ignore the fact that he's living with a Chinese woman?" "Mrs. Vane is his legal wife," Gaines said coolly. "There's nothing improper about a man living with his wife. She's corrupting the child, filling her head with foreign nonsense. The child speaks fluent English, knows her letters and numbers, and appears to be thriving. If that's corruption, Mr. Dolan, I'd say it's the beneficial kind." Frank opened his mouth to argue, but Harlow cut him off. "That's enough, Frank. The man's done his job. Let's go." They filed out, Frank shooting one last venomous look at Silas before mounting his horse. Gaines tipped his hat. "Good day, Mr. Vane, Mrs. Vane." Then they were gone, and the house was silent again. Silas stood in the middle of the room, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. Cora was still in his arms, and Mei Lian stood by the kitchen doorway, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "They're not taking her." Mei Lian crossed the room and threw her arms around both of them, sobbing. Cora hugged them both, and for a long moment the three of them just stood there, holding each other, letting the fear and tension drain away. "I was so scared," Mei Lian whispered. "I think they take her. I think they take you both from me." "They didn't," Silas said, "and they won't, not as long as I'm breathing." She pulled back and looked at him, her eyes red and swollen but filled with something fierce and bright. "You save us," she said, "again. We saved each other." That night, after Cora had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's ordeal, Silas and Mei Lian sat by the fire, neither of them speaking. The silence was different now, less uncertain, more companionable. "What do he ask you?" Silas said finally. "Gaines, in the kitchen." Mei Lian stared into the flames. "He asked if I happy, if you treat me good, if I have my own money, my own choices." She paused. "He asked if you force me to marry you." Silas went still. "What did you say?" She turned to look at him, her eyes steady. "I say no. I say you give me choice. You give me respect. You give me home." Her voice softened. "I say I lucky to have you." Silas's throat tightened. "I'm the one who's lucky." She smiled, small and tentative. "Maybe we both lucky." They sat in silence for a while longer, and then Mei Lian stood, stretching. "I go to bed now. Long day." "Yeah, me too." She started toward the hallway, then stopped and turned back. "Silas?" "Yeah." "Thank you for fighting for me, for fighting for us." He looked at her, at the firelight playing across her face, at the way she stood there like she belonged. like she was home. Always, he said. She nodded and disappeared down the hall, and Silas sat by the fire a while longer, thinking about everything that had happened, everything they'd survived. They'd won. But he knew, deep in his bones, that the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Winter began to loosen its grip slowly, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. The days grew longer, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the snow that had buried the ranch for months started to melt in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath. The sound of water dripping from the eaves became a constant music, and the air carried the faint promise of something new. Silas felt it in his bones, the shift, the change, the slow thaw of something that had been frozen for far too long. In the weeks following Gaines's visit, a strange kind of peace settled over the ranch. Cora went back to her routines with the resilience of childhood, chattering endlessly about spring and baby animals, and whether they could get chickens. Melian moved through the house with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before, her fear replaced by something steadier, something that looked almost like belonging. And Silas found himself watching her more than he should. He noticed the way she hummed while she cooked, the melody weaving through the house like thread through fabric. He noticed the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear with flour-dusted fingers. He noticed the way her face lit up when Cora ran to her with some new discovery, and the way she looked at him sometimes across the dinner table, her eyes dark and thoughtful. He noticed all of it, and he didn't know what to do with any of it. One evening in early March, when the wind had died down and the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Silas found Melian standing on the porch, looking out over the land. She had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and her breath misted in the cold air. He stepped out beside her, and they stood in silence for a moment. "Cora asleep?" he asked. "Yes. She talk about spring until she fall asleep talking." Melian smiled. "She want plant garden. She want grow vegetables like I teach her." "We can do that." "You sure? Garden lot of work." "So's everything else around here. What's a little more?" She laughed softly, and the sound did something strange to his chest. "You different now," she said quietly, still looking out at the horizon. "Different how?" "Less sad. Less like ghost." She glanced at him. "More like real person." Silas was quiet for a moment, turning that over in his mind. "You did that," he said finally. "Me?" "You and Cora. You brought me back." Melian shook her head. "No, you bring yourself back. We just give you reason." They stood there as the light faded, the sky deepening from gold to purple to indigo. The first stars appeared, cold and distant, and Silas felt something shift inside him, something he'd been holding on to for too long finally letting go. "Melian," he said quietly. "Yes?" "I know this marriage started as something practical, something to protect Cora and keep you safe. But I want you to know—" He stopped, struggling for the words. "I want you to know it doesn't have to stay that way. Not if you don't want it to." She turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face. "What you mean?" "I mean I care about you. More than I thought I would. More than I planned to." He dragged a hand through his hair. "And if you want this to be a real marriage, if you want us to be real, I'm willing to try. If you are." Her breath caught, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold but steady. "I already think of it as real," she said softly. "I think of you as real husband. I think of Cora as real daughter. I think of this as real family." Her eyes shimmered. "I just not know if you feel same." "I do," he said, and the words came easier than he expected. "I feel the same." She smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "Then we be real," she said. "We be real family, real husband and wife, real everything." Silas pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, resting her head against his chest. He held her there, feeling the warmth of her, the solidity, the simple miracle of not being alone. "I'm not good at this," he murmured into her hair. "At being a husband. At any of this." "I'm not good at being wife either," she said. "We learn together." Yeah, he said. Together. They stood there until the cold drove them inside, and that night, for the first time since the wedding, Silas didn't go to his room alone. Mei took his hand and led him down the hall, and when she opened the door to what had been her room, she looked back at him with a question in her eyes. He answered by stepping inside. The room was small and simple. A bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over the yard. But it felt different now, charged with possibility, and when Mei closed the door behind them, Silas felt something in his chest crack open completely. "You sure?" he asked. "I sure." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle, and he closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Me too. But I want this. I want you." "Then have me," she whispered. And he did. Spring arrived in earnest in late March, flooding the land with light and warmth. The snow melted away completely, leaving the earth soft and rich. Grass pushed up through the mud, pale green and tender, and the cottonwoods along the creek began to leaf out, their branches trembling in the wind. Cora was beside herself with excitement. She and Mei spent hours planning the garden, drawing maps on scraps of paper, arguing cheerfully about whether to plant carrots or beans, tomatoes or squash. Silas watched them from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, and felt something dangerously close to happiness. Mei had moved into his room, their room now, and the house had rearranged itself around this new reality. Her clothes hung beside his in the wardrobe. Her hairbrush sat on the dresser next to his razor. And at night, when his work was done and Cora was asleep, they lay together in the darkness, talking quietly about everything and nothing, learning each other slowly, carefully, like explorers mapping unknown territory. One morning in early April, Silas woke to find the bed empty beside him. He pulled on his clothes and went looking, and found Mei outside, standing in the yard with her face turned up to the sun, her eyes closed, a smile on her lips. "What are you doing?" he called. She opened her eyes and looked at him, her face radiant. "Feeling spring," she said. "Feeling alive." He walked over to her, and she took his hand. "I never think I have this," she said quietly. "Never think I have home, family, husband who care about me. I think I just survive. Just exist." She looked at him. "But now I live. Really live." Silas pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They started the garden that week, turning over the earth behind the house, breaking up the soil, mixing in manure from the barn. It was hard work, backbreaking and dirty, but Cora threw herself into it with the enthusiasm of a child who'd never been allowed to get her hands dirty before. She dug holes, planted seeds, carried buckets of water, and narrated the entire process in a running commentary that made Mei laugh until she cried. By the time they finished, the three of them were covered in mud, exhausted, and grinning like idiots. "Now we wait," Mei said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Seeds grow. We eat what we plant." "How long does it take?" Cora asked. "Depends. Some things fast, some things slow. We be patient." Cora wrinkled her nose. "I'm not good at patient." "Then you learn," Mei said, ruffling her hair. "Patience, good skill." That night, Silas lay in bed with Mei curled against his side, her breathing slow and steady, and he thought about patience, about waiting, about the slow, careful work of building something real out of the wreckage of what had come before. It had taken him 2 years to stop feeling like a ghost. It had taken Mei 4 months to bring warmth back into his house. And it had taken one reckless, desperate decision to turn survival into something that looked like a future. He didn't know what came next, didn't know if the town would ever accept them, or if Frank Dolan would finally let his grudge go, or if there would be more battles to fight. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. The confrontation came on a warm afternoon in late April, when the world was green and alive and the air smelled like grass and rain. Silas was repairing the fence line along the eastern pasture when he heard horses approaching. He straightened, shading his eyes, and his stomach sank when he recognized the riders. Frank Dolan, along with 2 other men, ranchers Silas knew by sight but not by name. They reined in their horses a few yards away, and Frank dismounted, his face hard. "Silas." "Frank?" We need to talk. So talk! Frank gestured to the other men, who dismounted as well, flanking him like soldiers. We've been patient, Frank said, given you time to come to your senses. But you haven't. You're still living with that woman, still letting her raise that little girl, still acting like what you're doing is acceptable. What I'm doing is living my life, on my land, with my family, none of which is any of your business. It is my business when you're corrupting the morals of this community. Silas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Corrupting the morals? I'm running a ranch and raising a kid. What the hell are you doing besides sticking your nose where it doesn't belong? One of the other men spoke up, his voice cold. You're setting a bad example, making it seem like it's acceptable to marry outside your race, to bring in foreign influences, to ignore the standards the rest of us live by. Standards, Silas repeated. That what we're calling bigotry now? Frank took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. You watch your mouth. Or what? You going to hit me? Take my land? Run me out of town? Silas crossed his arms. You already tried to take Cora. That didn't work. So what's your next move, Frank? Because I'm real curious. Frank's face flushed red. You think you're so smart. Think you've got it all figured out. But you don't. You're alone out here, Silas. You've made yourself an outcast. And when something happens, when you need help, when you need your neighbors, no one's going to come. You've burned those bridges. Good, Silas said flatly. I don't want help from people like you. I don't want anything from you except for you to get the hell off my land and leave my family alone. Your family, Frank spat. That Chinese woman isn't your family. She's my wife, Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. And if you finish that sentence, I'm going to break your jaw. Frank stared at him, his eyes blazing, and for a moment Silas thought he was going to do something stupid. But then the rancher turned and mounted his horse, his movements jerky with anger. You'll regret this, Frank said. Mark my words, you'll regret this. I already regret wasting time talking to you. Now get out. Frank spurred his horse and rode off, the other two men following. Silas stood there, his heart pounding, his hands shaking, and watched them disappear over the rise. When he got back to the house, Mei Lian was waiting on the porch, her face pale. I see them right away, she said. What they want? The same thing they always want, to make us miserable. You think they come back? I don't know. Maybe. She crossed her arms, her jaw set. I not leaving. I not let them scare me away. I know. And I'm not asking you to. Good. Because this my home too. I fight for it. Silas looked at her. This small, fierce woman who'd survived more than he could imagine, who'd crossed an ocean and lost everything and still found the strength to stand her ground, and felt a surge of fierce pride. Yeah, he said, we fight for it, together. Frank Dolan didn't come back, but his words lingered, a bitter taste in the air, and Silas knew the threat wasn't gone, just waiting. A week later, Silas rode into town for supplies, and this time Mei Lian came with him. She'd insisted, and he hadn't had the heart to say no. I your wife, she'd said firmly. I go where you go. I not hide. So they rode into Blackthorn together, Cora sitting in front of Silas on the saddle, and when they dismounted outside the general store, every person on the street stopped to stare. Silas took Mei Lian's hand and walked inside, his head high. Emmett looked up from behind the counter, his expression unreadable. Silas! Mrs. Vane. Emmett, what can I get you? Silas rattled off his list and Emmett pulled the items without comment. The store was quiet, too quiet, and Silas could feel the weight of eyes on them from the people standing near the windows, watching. When the supplies were loaded, Emmett cleared his throat. Silas, can I have a word? Silas glanced at Mei Lian, who nodded and followed Emmett to the back of the store. What is it? Emmett lowered his voice. I wanted to tell you, Frank's been trying to stir up trouble, talking to anyone who'll listen about running you out, making your life hell. But he's not getting the support he thinks he is. Silas frowned. What do you mean? I mean, people are tired of him. He's loud and mean and always looking for someone to hate. And most folks around here, they just want to get by. They don't care who you're married to as long as you keep to yourself. Emmett paused. I'm not saying everyone's on your side, but you've got more friends than you think. Silas stared at him, something tight in his chest loosening. Why are you telling me this? Emmett shrugged. Because I watched you stand up in that courthouse and marry that woman when everyone was against you. And I figured if a man's got that kind of courage, the least I can do is let him know he's not as alone as he thinks. Silas nodded slowly. Thanks, Emmett. Don't mention it. Just be careful. Frank's not the type to let things go. When they left the store, Mei Lian took his hand again, and they walked through town like they owned it. People stared, but no one said anything, and by the time they rode out, Silas felt something shift inside him. Maybe they were going to be all right. Maybe they were going to survive this after all. Summer came on fast and hot, turning the land golden and lush. The garden exploded with life. Tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots, lettuce, and Cora spent hours tending it, her face smudged with dirt, her hands stained green. Mei Lian taught her how to harvest, how to preserve, how to turn the earth's bounty into food for the winter ahead. The ranch thrived. The cattle were healthy, the horses strong, the land fertile. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house began to change. Silas tore down the old barn, the one where Mei Lian had slept those first 4 months, freezing and alone. He salvaged what wood he could and used it to build a better chicken coop, a new storage shed, a covered porch that wrapped around the front of the house. Mei Lian watched him work, and one evening, as the sun set and the sky turned orange and pink, she came outside and stood beside him. "Why you do this?" she asked. "Do what?" "Tear down barn, build new things." Silas set down his hammer and looked at her. "Because I don't want any reminders of how things used to be. I want everything to be new, better, the way it should have been from the start." She smiled, her eyes shining. "You good man, Silas Vane." "I'm trying to be." She stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. It was the first time she'd said it. Silas pulled back, looking down at her, his heart pounding. "I love you too," he said, and the words felt right, felt true. Felt like something he should have said weeks ago. She laughed, her face radiant, and kissed him again. By August, the ranch looked completely different. The old barn was gone, replaced by new structures that gleamed in the sun. The garden was a riot of color and life. The house had been painted, the porch expanded, the windows repaired. And everywhere Silas looked, he saw evidence of the life they'd built together. Cora had grown taller, browner, wilder. She ran barefoot through the grass, climbed trees, swam in the creek, and came home every evening covered in dirt and grinning from ear to ear. She called Mei Lian Mama without hesitation, and she told anyone who would listen that she had the best family in the whole world. And Mei Lian bloomed. Her face lost the sharp edges of fear and hunger. Her eyes were bright and clear. Her laughter came easily, ringing through the house like music. She moved through the world with confidence, with purpose, with the kind of joy that comes from finally being home. One night in late August, they sat on the new porch together, watching the stars come out. Cora had fallen asleep on the rug inside, and the house glowed warm and golden behind them. "You happy?" Silas asked. Mei Lian leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "I happy," she said. "More happy than I ever think I could be." "Me too." She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You think Cora ever forget her real parents?" Silas thought about that. "I don't think she'll forget them, but I think she'll remember us too. And I think that's okay. You good father to her." "You're a good mother." She smiled. "We good family." "Yeah," he said, "we are." They sat there as the night deepened, the stars wheeling overhead, the land quiet and peaceful around them. And Silas thought about everything that had happened, the loss, the grief, the fear, the desperate gamble that had turned into something real. He thought about the woman beside him, the child sleeping inside, the life they'd built from nothing but courage and stubborn hope. And he realized that for the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his entire life, he wasn't just surviving. He was living, really, truly living. The final confrontation with Frank Dolan came on a bright September morning, when the air was cool and crisp and the leaves on the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn gold. Silas was in town picking up supplies when Frank cornered him outside the saloon. He was drunk. Silas could smell the whiskey from 3 feet away, and his face was flushed and angry. "Thought you'd won, didn't you?" Frank slurred. "I'm not interested in talking to you, Frank." "Too bad. I'm interested in talking to you." Silas tried to step around him, but Frank grabbed his arm. "You think you're so special. Think you can just ignore the rules the rest of us live by. But you can't. You're not better than me, Silas. You're not better than anyone." Silas pulled his arm free. "I never said I was. I just said I'm not going to let you run my life. You've ruined this town, brought shame on all of us, and for what? For some Chinese whore who—" Silas's fist connected with Frank's jaw before the man could finish the sentence. Frank went down hard, sprawling in the dirt, blood streaming from his mouth. Silas stood over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles throbbing. "Her name is Mei Lian," he said, his voice low and deadly. "She's my wife, and if you ever talk about her like that again, I will put you in the ground. Do you understand me?" Frank stared up at him, his eyes wide with shock and fear, and for the first time he didn't say anything. Silas turned and walked away, his hands still shaking, his heart pounding. Behind him, he heard someone start to clap. He turned and saw Emmett standing in the doorway of the general store, a grin on his face. "About damn time someone shut him up," Emmett called. A few other people emerged from nearby buildings, and to Silas's shock, they were smiling, nodding. One of them even tipped his hat. Silas stood there stunned and realized that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about this town. Not everyone was like Frank. Not everyone hated him. Some people just wanted to live their lives, same as he did. When he got back to the ranch, Mei Lian took one look at his bruised knuckles and sighed. "You hit someone." "Yeah." "Frank Dolan?" "Yeah." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "You impossible man." He had it coming. "I sure he did." She took his hand and led him to the basin, where she washed the blood off his knuckles and wrapped them in clean cloth. "You always protect me, even when I'm not there." "Always," he said. She kissed him, soft and sweet, and he pulled her close. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." And standing there in the kitchen, with the sun streaming through the windows and the smell of bread baking in the oven, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt whole. The first frost came in October, painting the grass silver and turning the leaves on the cottonwoods to gold. The garden had been harvested, the root cellar was full, and the ranch was ready for winter. But this winter would be different. This winter, the barn was gone, and Mei Lian slept in a warm bed beside her husband. This winter, Cora had a mother and a father and a home that felt like home. This winter, the house was full of life and laughter and love. On the first night of frost, the three of them sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. "Tell me a story, Mama," Cora said, snuggling against Mei Lian. "What kind of story?" "A happy one, with a happy ending." Mei Lian glanced at Silas, and he smiled. "I know one," Mei Lian said. "Once upon a time there was a woman who had nothing. She lose everything, her family, her home, her hope. She thinks she'll never be happy again." "That's sad," Cora said. "Wait, story not over." Mei Lian stroked Cora's hair. "Then one day she meet a man and a little girl, and they give her something she never thinks she have again. They give her family, they give her home, they give her love." "And they all lived happily ever after?" Cora asked. Mei Lian looked at Silas, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said softly. "They all live happily ever after." Cora sighed contentedly and closed her eyes, and Silas reached over and took Mei Lian's hand. "You think that's true?" he asked quietly. "Happily ever after?" "I think we make it true," she said. "Every day we make it true." He pulled her close, and they sat there together, husband, wife, daughter, watching the stars wheel overhead, the land stretching out around them, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. The barn was gone, torn down and rebuilt into something better. The winter that had once nearly killed them had become just another season to survive and transcend. And the three people sitting on that porch, wrapped in blankets and bound by love, had become something none of them had ever expected to find. They had become a family. Not a perfect family, not a family without scars or struggles or hard days ahead, but a real family. A family built on courage, on choice, on the simple, radical act of refusing to give up. And as the stars burned cold and bright above them, and the wind whispered through the grass, and the house glowed warm behind them, Silas Vane, the man who had once been a ghost, closed his eyes and let himself believe in something he'd thought was lost forever. He let himself believe in home.